Is morality nothing more than a human invention, an illusion we cling to in a meaningless universe? Moral nihilism is the belief that moral values are not objective. They don't exist independently of human thought. Ideas like right and wrong, good and evil, are not eternal truths but social constructs, tools created to enforce order and control behavior. If moral nihilism is true, then no action is inherently moral or immoral. Kindness and cruelty, charity and violence, at their core, are neither right nor wrong. Few thinkers confront this idea as bluntly as Friedrich Nietzsche. When he declared God is dead, he wasn't just rejecting religion, he was describing a world where the foundation of morality had collapsed. For centuries, moral codes derived their authority from divine command, rules believed to be woven into the fabric of reality. But if there is no God, there are no absolute moral laws, and humanity faces the terrifying freedom of living in a world where nothing is forbidden and nothing is required. For Nietzsche, this moral vacuum wasn't just a crisis, it was an opportunity. Without external rules, we are free to create our own values, to shape new systems of meaning. But this freedom comes at a cost. Without the comfort of universal truths, there is no objective reason to prefer compassion over cruelty, or life over destruction. Everything becomes a matter of will, and those strong enough to define new values impose meaning on a world that offers none. Moral nihilists go even further. They reject both moral realism, the idea that moral truths exist independently of human minds, and moral relativism, which allows for different moral truths across cultures. To the nihilist, morality is nothing more than a useful fiction, a tool societies use to maintain power and enforce social norms. Beneath the surface of every moral law is the will to control. And if the universe itself is indifferent, then no action, no matter how kind or cruel, can ever be truly justified or condemned. But can we really live this way? Critics argue that moral nihilism leads to moral apathy, a world where nothing matters and no one is held accountable. If there's no real distinction between right and wrong, why care about justice, kindness, or suffering? If murder is no more wrong than generosity, what stops us from descending into violence and chaos? And on a personal level, if life is stripped of moral meaning, how do you find purpose beyond survival? Others challenge the scientific plausibility of moral nihilism. Evolutionary biology suggests that moral instincts, like empathy and fairness, emerge to foster cooperation and survival. While these instincts may not be objective in a cosmic sense, they are deeply ingrained in human nature. Morality, critics argue, isn't an illusion, it's a necessary feature of social life. Without it, trust disintegrates and societies collapse. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre acknowledge the absence of objective moral laws, but reject the moral indifference of nihilism. For Sartre, the lack of external meaning forces us to choose our own values, and that choice is an act of radical freedom. The absence of moral absolutes does not free us from responsibility. It makes us fully responsible for the values we live by. In other words, just because the universe doesn't care doesn't mean we shouldn't. But the haunting question remains. If morality is nothing more than a convenient fiction, do our ethical commitments really matter? Are acts of kindness and cruelty just choices, with no deeper significance? And if nothing is inherently right or wrong, what stops us from doing anything we want? Imagine a person who always smiles, never shows anger, and prides themselves on being nice. On the surface, they seem perfect. But beneath that mask, there's resentment, an unspoken frustration that spills out in subtle ways. Maybe they gossip or quietly undermine others. This is Carl Jung's The Shadow, the hidden part of ourselves that contains everything we reject or suppress. Think of it like a shadow cast by light. The brighter you try to appear, the darker the shadow becomes. Jung believed the traits we deny, anger, envy, desire, don't just disappear. Instead, they operate unconsciously, shaping our behavior without us realizing it. For example, a person who denies their ambition might criticize others for being too competitive. It's easier to judge others than to face the truth in yourself. But is the shadow always a villain? Not necessarily. Jung argued that the shadow isn't purely negative. It holds unrealized potential. Repressed creativity, courage, or independence can hide in the shadow, waiting to be integrated. By confronting these parts, we become whole. Yet, critics argue that this romanticizes dangerous impulses. If we embrace every part of ourselves, are we excusing harmful behaviors? Others claim the shadow oversimplifies human complexity, Can all unconscious desires be bundled into one metaphor? Still, whether you acknowledge it or not, your shadow is always there. And the less you face it, the more power it holds over you. Picture a snake eating its own tail, an ancient symbol found in Egyptian, Greek, and Norse mythology. At first glance, it represents cycles, life and death, creation and destruction. But it also reveals a deeper philosophical puzzle, self-reference. Consider how we try to explain reality. Every answer seems to point back to another question. What caused the universe? And what caused that cause? At some point, the explanations circle back on themselves. Nietzsche took this further with his idea of eternal recurrence, the belief that life may repeat itself infinitely. If you had to live this life over and over, would you change how you live now? Yet, not everyone agrees that reality is a circle. Bertrand Russell criticized self-referential systems, arguing that they lead to logical contradictions. And some philosophers reject the Ouroboros entirely. Why assume the universe loops endlessly when a definite beginning might be simpler? Still, the Ouroboros holds a mysterious appeal. In one sense, it's a trap, an endless loop with no escape. But in another, it suggests a profound truth, that life feeds on itself, and that even endings are beginnings in disguise. Why does suffering seem to follow us, no matter how much we try to escape it? Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering isn't a glitch in existence, it's built into its very structure. In The World as Will and Representation, he describes life as an endless struggle where desire itself is the source of suffering. The moment one desire is fulfilled, another emerges, leaving us restless, always chasing, but never satisfied. Buddhism echoes this view with the concept of dukkha, the truth that all existence is marked by unsatisfactoriness. Even joy is temporary, shadowed by the inevitability of loss. This view suggests that suffering isn't something we can fix. It's part of the price of being conscious. But does life have to be this bleak? Aristotle offers a different view. He believed that struggle can be meaningful. Through effort and hardship, we achieve eudaimonia, a flourishing life where pain serves a purpose. Even Nietzsche, despite acknowledging suffering, argued that pain is essential for growth. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Still, Schopenhauer's vision lingers. If suffering is baked into reality, no amount of progress will ever remove it. And perhaps the hardest truth is this. Even when life is good, the shadow of suffering is always nearby, waiting to return. Why does the sight of a corpse disturb us? Why do certain things feel viscerally wrong? Julia Kristeva's theory of abjection explores this, suggesting that horror arises when boundaries break down. A living body is orderly, it breathes, it moves. But a corpse disrupts that order. It blurs the line between life and death. This reaction isn't just biological, it's psychological. Kristeva argues that our sense of identity depends on keeping boundaries intact, between self and other, between clean and unclean. Anything that crosses these lines provokes abjection. You can see this in how societies treat outsiders. Historically, those deemed unclean, or other, are cast out to maintain social purity. Kristeva believed that abjection reveals the fragility of identity. By rejecting the abject, we preserve the illusion of a stable self. Critics push back against this idea. Anthropologists note that many cultures engage with death openly. Some perform rituals with human remains, showing that abjection isn't universal. Others argue that the theory over-intellectualizes a basic biological response. Maybe we're just hardwired to avoid decay for survival. Still, abjection touches something primal. It suggests that beneath the surface of order lies chaos. And the things we push away never really disappear. They hover on the edge, waiting to break through. Imagine a machine that could simulate the perfect life. Every pleasure, every achievement, so vivid that you could never tell it wasn't real. Once you're plugged in, everything feels authentic. No pain, no failure, just endless bliss. If happiness is the ultimate goal, why wouldn't you choose to enter? Philosopher Robert Nozick posed this question in 1974, and his answer was disturbing. He argued that most people wouldn't plug in. Why? Because we value reality itself, not just the feeling of happiness. We want to be someone doing something real, not just experiencing a perfect illusion. If all that mattered was pleasure, the experience machine should offer the ideal life. But it doesn't. There's something deeper we crave: authenticity, truth, and genuine connection. Nozick's thought experiment challenges hedonism, the belief that pleasure is the highest good. If hedonism were true, this machine would be paradise. But the fact that many hesitate suggests that we value more than just pleasure. We care about the kind of life we live, not just how it feels from the inside. What's the point of success, love, or wisdom if it's nothing more than a perfectly crafted illusion? Yet, critics of Nozick's argument raise an unsettling question. If you can't tell the difference, why should it matter? If happiness feels the same whether it's real or simulated, why reject it? Utilitarians argue that the experience machine is not a deception, it's an opportunity. If morality is about maximizing happiness, isn't the machine the most ethical choice? After all, millions of people endure lives of pain and disappointment. If technology could eliminate that suffering, why wouldn't we use it? And there's another challenge. What is reality anyway? Some philosophers argue that our experiences, even outside the machine, are already filtered through our senses and brains. If your perception of the world is already a kind of simulation, how different is the experience machine? If your memories, relationships, and even your identity feel real, does it really matter if they're not? But Nozick's deeper worry lingers. By plugging in, you would give up the ability to shape your own life. You wouldn't be making choices or confronting challenges. You would become passive, just a recipient of experiences handed to you. And there's something unsettling about that loss of agency. A life without struggle may sound appealing, but would it really be a life worth living? We often think of memory as a virtue, preserving the past, honoring history. But what if forgetting is just as important? The ethics of forgetting questions whether there are times when it is morally right, or even necessary, to let go of the past. Consider personal trauma. For someone haunted by a painful memory, forgetting can be an act of survival. Entire societies face similar dilemmas. After a war or dictatorship, should a nation remember every crime, or is it better to forget in order to rebuild? South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrestled with this, offering amnesty to perpetrators of apartheid-era crimes in exchange for truth-telling. The goal wasn't punishment, it was national healing through selective forgetting. But forgetting has its dangers. Philosopher George Santayana famously warned, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Forgetting crimes can allow injustices to persist. Critics argue that erasing memory risks whitewashing history, making it easier to repeat old mistakes. Yet, supporters of forgetting claim that endless remembrance chains people to the past. Without the ability to forget, there is no room for forgiveness. Perhaps the real ethical challenge isn't whether to remember or forget, but knowing when each is the right choice. What if freedom isn't always what it seems? Herbert Marcuse's idea of repressive desublimation suggests that modern societies use pleasure to suppress rebellion. In simpler terms, you're given freedom to consume movies, music, entertainment, but not freedom to challenge the system. Imagine a world where you're free to binge-watch TV shows, shop endlessly, and express yourself online, but are not allowed to stand up against the elites. According to Marcuse, this isn't true freedom, it's a subtle form of control. The very pleasures that seem to liberate us keep us distracted and compliant. Consumer culture offers endless satisfaction, but by focusing on personal gratification, it prevents us from questioning why things are the way they are. Critics argue that Marcuse's theory underestimates individual autonomy. Just because we enjoy entertainment doesn't mean we're brainwashed. People can both consume media and engage in meaningful change. Others question whether pleasure is inherently repressive. Can't joy be a form of resistance too? Still, Marcuse's warning remains relevant. When everything is allowed, nothing seems urgent. And perhaps the most effective way to suppress dissent isn't by forbidding it, but by drowning it in distractions. Is reality as we perceive it, or is there something hidden beneath appearances? Immanuel Kant's concept of Ding and Sich, or the thing in itself, suggests that the world as it exists independently is unknowable to us, as everything we can perceive is a reality our mind creates from the stimuli our senses receive. Kant argued that our minds don't passively receive reality, they actively shape it. Space, time, and causality aren't inherent features of the world, they're categories imposed by human perception. What lies beyond these categories, the thing in itself, is forever hidden. Critics accuse Kant of creating a metaphysical gap without evidence. Why assume an unknowable reality behind appearances? Others, like Schopenhauer, modified the concept, arguing that the thing in itself is not an abstraction, but the will that drives existence. Still, Kant's insight reshaped modern thought. It suggests that no matter how much science explains, something about reality always eludes us. And if the world we experience is shaped by our senses, how much of what we call real is just a projection of ourselves? The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. With these words, Henry David Thoreau described the silent suffering hidden beneath the routines of everyday life. People follow social expectations, working jobs they dislike, pursuing goals they never questioned, yet beneath the surface they feel trapped. Consider the person who measures their life by external markers, wealth, status, approval, only to find an emptiness no success can fill. Thoreau believed that modern society pushes people toward this kind of empty existence, numbing them with distractions that keep them from confronting deeper questions about what truly matters. But is this too cynical? Critics argue that quiet lives aren't always desperate. Many find meaning in ordinary routines and simple pleasures. And not everyone is weighed down by society's expectations. Some people find contentment precisely by embracing their roles. Still, the idea of quiet desperation forces a haunting question. How much of your life is truly your own? And if you stripped away society's demands, would you still live the way you do? What can you be sure of is real? This question consumed philosopher René Descartes. To find absolute truth, he took a radical approach, doubting everything. If any belief could be questioned, it had to go. He started with his senses, the foundation of most knowledge. But senses can deceive. A stick in water looks bent. A distant square object seems circular. And if your senses fail, how can you trust them? But Descartes went further. What if he was dreaming? Dreams feel real while they happen. So how could he be sure this wasn't just another illusion? And then he imagined something darker, an evil demon. What if a powerful deceiver controlled every sensation, every thought? If that were true, nothing outside his own mind could ever be trusted. Yet, in the depths of his doubt, Descartes found a truth he couldn't deny. The very act of doubting proved he existed. Even if everything else was false, there had to be a thinker doing the doubting. From this, he concluded, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But this certainty was isolating. Descartes had proven his own existence, but nothing else. The external world? Still uncertain. Other people? Possibly illusions. Critics, however, argue that radical skepticism is impractical. You don't question reality when you stub your toe. The pain is real enough. Pragmatists like William James suggest that truth isn't about certainty, it's about usefulness. If a belief helps us navigate the world, isn't that true enough? Science also pushes back. The laws of nature work consistently. If reality were an illusion, how could experiments produce the same results again and again? Yet, the haunting question remains. If your mind is the only thing you can know for sure, how can you trust anything else? If you peel away every belief, what's left? Can you ever truly know what it's like to be someone else? This is the unsettling question behind the isolated mind problem, the idea that subjective experience, the way the world feels from within, can never be fully accessed by anyone else. Even if you understand someone's emotions intellectually, their inner world remains a private reality, forever out of reach. Philosopher Thomas Nagel captured this dilemma in his famous question, what is it like to be a bat? We can study bats scientifically. We can learn about their echolocation, their brain chemistry, even their behavior. But none of this tells us what it feels like to navigate the world using sonar, to experience life as a bat. This points to a troubling limit. Even with perfect scientific knowledge, some aspects of consciousness may remain unknowable. This problem extends beyond bats. It applies to all consciousness. No matter how much you study another person's brain, you will never be them. You can never step inside their mind. The pain of loss, the thrill of victory, the depth of nostalgia, these are felt, not just understood. And if subjective experience is fundamentally private, does that mean we are all trapped within our own isolated mental worlds? But critics push back. They argue that this overstates the mystery. After all, we do understand each other. We empathize. We recognize suffering and joy. If human experiences were completely isolated, how could we communicate so effectively? Neuroscience is rapidly mapping how subjective states correspond to brain activity, revealing the biological patterns behind emotions, perceptions, and even thoughts. If we can scan a brain and predict what a person is feeling, doesn't that prove minds are not as separate as we assume? Yet, others counter that no amount of physical explanation can fully capture what an experience feels like. You can study the chemistry of love, but that doesn't give you love. You can analyze the neural pathways of fear, but that doesn't make you afraid. Even if brain activity perfectly correlated with emotion, it wouldn't bridge the gap between external observation and internal experience. And if minds are truly isolated, if we can never fully share our consciousness, then perhaps the deepest truths of human existence will always remain locked within, forever unknowable to anyone but ourselves. Is there a central point in your mind where you exist? It feels like there is. A private mental space where sights, sounds, and thoughts all come together. A place where you, the conscious observer, sit and experience the world. This is the intuition behind what philosopher Daniel Dennett called the Cartesian Theater. The metaphor refers to an imaginary place in your brain where consciousness happens, like a movie projected on a screen for a tiny observer inside your mind. The name comes from René Descartes, who, in his famous cogito argument, "I think, therefore I am," suggested that the mind is a separate, non-physical substance interacting with the body. This implied a kind of inner control room where consciousness receives and interprets sensory information. But Dennett argues that this is an illusion. According to his multiple drafts model, there is no single place where consciousness comes together. Instead, the brain works like a decentralized network, different processes happening simultaneously without any central observer watching the show. What you experience as a unified, seamless awareness is just the brain combining and editing these processes after the fact. In this view, consciousness is not a movie playing for a hidden self. It's the output of countless unconscious mechanisms working in parallel. And here's the disturbing part. If Dennett is right, there's no you in control, just a collection of processes running themselves. Your sense of being a conscious self, a captain steering the ship, is nothing more than a convincing illusion. But critics aren't convinced. They argue that Dennett's view fails to explain the unity of experience. If consciousness is just scattered processes, why does it feel like everything comes together into a single, coherent stream? You don't experience yourself in fragments. You feel like a whole person, moving through time with thoughts and sensations perfectly synchronized. Neuroscience also challenges Dennett's dismissal of a center. Studies show that certain brain regions, like the posterior cingulate cortex and anterior insula, light up consistently during self-reflection and awareness. Damage to these areas can disrupt a person's sense of identity and the continuity of consciousness. If there's no core to consciousness, why do these areas play such a crucial role in shaping who we are? Other critics point to introspective evidence. You can directly reflect on your experiences. Doesn't that suggest some internal observer is watching, analyzing, and making decisions? But if Dennett is right, this observer is just a byproduct, a useful illusion your brain creates to make sense of its own workings. You are not a unified, stable self. You are a collection of ever-shifting processes, none of which are truly in charge. And that leaves a haunting possibility. What if the person you believe yourself to be, the voice in your head, doesn't really exist at all? What if the best response to the world is to do nothing? Quietism is a philosophical and spiritual attitude that emphasizes passivity and withdrawal from worldly affairs. It suggests that action is futile because reality is beyond human control. In the 17th century, Christian quietists like Miguel de Molinos taught that true spiritual peace comes from surrendering the will entirely to God. Rather than striving or struggling, the quietist accepts the world as it is, without resistance. In Eastern philosophy, a similar idea appears in Taoism. Laozi's concept of wu wei, or effortless action, suggests that by aligning with the natural flow of the universe, one achieves harmony without force. But critics argue that quietism can lead to moral complacency. If we simply accept injustice, are we allowing harm to continue? Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre condemned quietism as a form of bad faith, a way to avoid responsibility for shaping the world. Yet, quietism offers a radical alternative to the modern obsession with control. It suggests that much of human suffering comes from grasping and striving. And perhaps, by letting go, we discover a kind of freedom that effort alone cannot bring. Can too much morality drain us? Moral exhaustion refers to the psychological fatigue caused by the constant demand to make ethical choices. In a world where every action, what you buy, what you say, even what you post online, carries moral implications, the pressure to do the right thing can become overwhelming. Consider the ethical dilemmas we face daily. Is your food ethically sourced? Are your clothes produced under fair conditions? This moral hyper-awareness can lead to burnout, where people feel too drained to act at all. Philosopher Susan Wolf highlights this tension, arguing that living a purely moral life can crowd out personal happiness and creativity. Critics of this idea suggest that moral fatigue is just an excuse for apathy. If people are exhausted by ethical concerns, shouldn't they work harder to change unjust systems? Others point out that moral reflection is a sign of a healthy society. If we stop caring, what happens to those who suffer from injustice? Yet, moral exhaustion reveals a deeper tension between living for others and living for yourself. And in a world where every choice carries ethical weight, the question becomes, how much responsibility can any one person bear? Can you derive moral truths from facts? This is the heart of what philosophers call the is-ought gap, a problem first articulated by David Hume in the 18th century. Hume argued that no matter how many facts you gather about the world, how things are, you can never logically leap to a conclusion about how things ought to be. There is a fundamental gap between descriptive statements and moral prescriptions, and no fact by itself can tell you what is right or wrong. Imagine you observe a wolf pack. The strongest wolf takes the best food and asserts dominance. This is simply how things are, a fact of nature. But does that mean human societies should follow the same logic, that the strong deserve more than the weak? Nature may describe how life functions, but it doesn't tell us how life should be. Hume's insight exposes a troubling implication. Moral truths may not be grounded in objective reality at all. For centuries, societies have justified moral systems by appealing to nature, arguing, for instance, that rigid social hierarchies reflect the natural order. Hume dismantled this reasoning. Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's right. Murder, theft, and selfishness all occur in nature, but that doesn't make them morally acceptable. If moral obligations cannot be drawn from the structure of the world itself, where do they come from? But not everyone accepts this moral vacuum. Philosopher John Searle argues that in some cases, you can bridge the gap through commitments and social agreements. If you promise to repay a loan, you create an obligation. The fact that you made the promise leads directly to the moral duty to keep it. In this sense, some moral truths emerge from human practices. Once you enter into a social contract, moral obligations follow logically. Others, like Philippa Foot, claim that morality is anchored in facts about human well-being. Just as a plant needs sunlight to thrive, humans require certain conditions, safety, cooperation, and dignity to flourish. If something harms human flourishing, it is naturally wrong. Under this view, moral truths arise from facts about what allows humans to live good lives. But Hume's challenge runs deeper. Even if morality promotes well-being, why should we care? Just because humans need something doesn't mean they ought to have it. A dictator who thrives by exploiting others may not find any reason to value human flourishing. And if moral truths require human agreement or biological function, are they truly objective, or just reflections of human desires? The most unsettling possibility is that all moral claims are illusions, subjective preferences disguised as universal truths. When you strip away sentiment and social convention, moral obligations may not be written into the fabric of the universe. They might be nothing more than the rules we invent to survive. And if that's true, what happens when we decide to stop following them? Can you analyze something without distorting what it really means? This is the heart of the paradox of analysis, a puzzle first articulated by philosopher G. Moore, which questions whether any definition can fully capture the complexity of a concept without losing something essential in the process. Here's the dilemma. If a definition is correct, it should already be obvious. But if it's informative, it risks changing the meaning. Take the concept of knowledge. One famous definition says knowledge is justified true belief. It sounds clear. If you believe something, have good reasons for it, and it's true, you know it. But does that definition really capture what it feels like to know something? Is knowledge simply a mechanical checklist, or is there something more intuitive that gets lost in the process? Imagine trying to define love. You could describe it chemically, hormonal reactions in the brain, the release of oxytocin, but would that truly explain what it feels like to fall in love? Something vital slips through the cracks. And that's the heart of the paradox. Can words ever fully contain the essence of human experience? More believe that the act of analysis inevitably flattens the richness of concepts. Definitions aim to be precise, but reality is often messy. By reducing complex ideas to simple formulas, something ineffable, something that can only be felt or experienced, gets left behind. But not everyone accepts this limitation. Philosophers like Frank Ramsey argue that analysis isn't about capturing every nuance. It's about clarifying our ideas. Imperfect definitions still sharpen our understanding. When we analyze concepts like justice or truth, even if we lose subtlety, we gain structure and coherence. Others point to scientific progress. Complex phenomena, like life itself, once seemed beyond explanation. But as biology advanced, we unraveled mysteries once thought too profound for analysis. If science can decode life, why should philosophical concepts be any different? And there's a deeper challenge to the paradox itself. What if the vagueness is the illusion? Philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein argue that the apparent mystery of concepts only exists because language is imprecise. According to this view, the more carefully we analyze a concept, the less mysterious it becomes. Maybe love, beauty, and even consciousness aren't beyond definition. We just haven't reached the right level of clarity yet. But the paradox won't die easily. Some truths seem to resist analysis. No matter how many words you use, you can't explain the color red to someone blind from birth. You can break down consciousness into brain processes, but can you capture the feeling of being alive? And if the most profound experiences, love, identity, meaning, can never be fully dissected, then perhaps the deepest truths about reality can only be felt, not explained. So we're left with a haunting question. Are words powerful enough to reveal reality, or are there truths forever beyond the reach of language? Are you really in control of your actions, or is freedom just an illusion? It feels like you're free. You choose what to eat, who to love, and how to live. But what if every decision you make is already determined by forces beyond your control? This is the unsettling question at the heart of the free will debate, the clash between personal freedom and causal determinism. Determinists argue that every action you take can be traced back to prior causes, genetics, environment, and the laws of physics. You might feel free, but every thought, every decision, is just the inevitable result of a chain of events set in motion long before you were born. Modern neuroscience strengthens this view. In the 1980s, experiments by Benjamin Libet revealed that brain activity linked to decision-making occurs milliseconds before we become consciously aware of making a choice. If your brain decides before you do, are you really in control? Think about it. When you pick up a coffee cup, it feels like a free choice. But beneath the surface, neurons are firing, shaped by years of habits and unconscious conditioning. If everything you do arises from prior causes you didn't choose, can any decision ever truly be yours? But compatibilists reject this bleak conclusion. Thinkers like Daniel Dennett argue that free will and determinism aren't mutually exclusive. According to them, freedom doesn't require breaking the laws of physics. It simply means acting according to your own desires without being coerced. If you wanted coffee and you got coffee, wasn't that a free choice, even if the underlying causes were determined? For compatibilists, as long as your actions reflect your internal motivations, you're free, whether or not those motivations are predetermined. Libertarians, not to be confused with the political movement, take a stronger stance. They argue for true free will, insisting that human beings possess a unique form of agency beyond physical causation. Some libertarians point to quantum mechanics, where subatomic particles behave unpredictably, as evidence that determinism breaks down at the microscopic level. If the universe itself contains genuine randomness, isn't it possible that human decisions arise from something similarly unpredictable, something outside the rigid chain of cause and effect? But there's a problem. Does randomness really give you freedom? If your actions were random, they wouldn't be under your control, they'd just be accidents of chance. Whether the universe is rigidly determined or fundamentally random, where is there room for true autonomy? And here's the most disturbing part. If free will is an illusion, what happens to moral responsibility? If people are simply biological machines responding to prior causes, how can we hold them accountable for their actions? Is a criminal guilty if their brain was wired by genetics and childhood trauma? Should we punish people if they couldn't have chosen otherwise? And if all your thoughts and decisions are already set by the laws of nature, do you even deserve credit for your successes? Yet, despite these arguments, the feeling of freedom remains undeniable. You experience your choices as real and voluntary. Even if science suggests otherwise, can we really accept that we're nothing more than puppets pulled by invisible strings? Is hope a blessing or a curse? At its best, hope offers light in the darkest times, a belief that no matter how bad things are, they can get better. It sustains people through illness, loss, and despair. Without hope, the future would seem cold, meaningless, and unbearable. But hope has a darker side. What if it's nothing more than a cruel trick? A form of self-deception that keeps us chasing dreams that will never come true? The ancient Greeks understood this duality. In the myth of Pandora's box, the gods unleashed every evil, disease, suffering, and death upon the world. But one thing remained trapped inside: hope. Was hope left behind as a gift to ease human suffering, or as the final torment, ensuring that people would forever long for what they could never attain? Friedrich Nietzsche took the second view. He called hope the worst of all evils, not because it fails, but because it prolongs suffering. For Nietzsche, hope is a cruel illusion that prevents people from accepting reality as it is. Instead of confronting life's harsh truths, hopeful people cling to fantasies, dreaming of a better future that will never arrive. And in doing so, they remain trapped in perpetual disappointment. But not everyone sees hope as a deception. Gabriel Marcel, a 20th century existentialist, argued that hope isn't mere wishful thinking, it's an active choice. For Marcel, true hope acknowledges pain and uncertainty, yet still engages with life rather than retreating into despair. While optimism blindly assumes things will get better, hope recognizes hardship, but chooses to believe in the possibility of change. For Marcel, hope is not weakness. It is an act of spiritual defiance against the absurdity of a broken world. And hope can be powerful. It drives people to fight against injustice, to endure unimaginable suffering, and to hold on when everything seems lost. Without hope, would anyone resist tyranny? Would anyone recover from grief? Would anyone bother to dream at all? Yet, critics warn of hope's dangers. It can blind people to reality, leading them to ignore harsh truths or delay action. If hope becomes an excuse to wait for things to improve, it can become a prison, trapping people in false expectations and perpetual disappointment. Sometimes, hope prevents people from accepting life as it is, a harsh, indifferent reality where no happy ending is guaranteed. And perhaps the most chilling thought is this: what if hope is just a survival mechanism? An evolutionary trick to keep us pushing forward, no matter how meaningless the struggle might be. If there is no greater purpose, no final redemption, then hope is not a gift, it's just another illusion that keeps us from facing the void. But even with that possibility, hope persists. In the darkest moments, when reason gives no comfort, hope remains. And maybe, in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, choosing to hope is the most radical act of defiance there is. At the heart of Mahayana Buddhism lies a concept that challenges the very fabric of reality, sunyata, or the Emptiness Doctrine. It argues that nothing, no object, no person, no thought, exists independently. Everything is empty of intrinsic, unchanging essence. What you see, touch, and even are, is nothing but a fleeting web of relationships and conditions. This idea was developed by the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in the 2nd century through his middle way philosophy. According to Nagarjuna, the world we experience appears solid, but this is an illusion created by our minds. Nothing exists in and of itself. For example, take a cup. You think of it as a fixed object, but what is it really? It depends on countless conditions: the clay it's made from, the hands that shaped it, the observer who perceives it. Without these relationships, the cup is nothing. Its essence is empty. And the same is true of you. What you call I, your identity, is not a fixed, permanent self. It's a shifting combination of physical sensations, thoughts, memories, and social roles. But there is no unchanging core beneath these processes. You are not a singular being. You are a flow. And by clinging to the illusion of a permanent self, you trap yourself in suffering, longing for things to last when nothing does. For Buddhists, realizing this truth is a form of liberation. If everything is empty, including your ego, you are free from attachment. Pain and loss lose their sting when you no longer see them as happening to a permanent you. This insight is not despair, it's freedom. But critics argue that this view is dangerously close to nihilism. If everything is empty, what stops the world from collapsing into meaninglessness? If the self is an illusion, why care about morality, relationships, or even life itself? If nothing has an intrinsic value, why bother striving for anything at all? And there's a psychological cost. If identity is just an illusion, what happens to your sense of purpose? If there is no real you, how do you navigate the world without losing yourself in it? This perspective can provoke an unsettling question. If everything is empty, does anything matter? But defenders of sunyata insist that emptiness is not the same as nothingness. It doesn't mean things don't exist. It means they exist dependently. The cup exists, but only because of the conditions that bring it into being. The self exists, but only as a collection of processes, not as an isolated entity. Instead of nihilism, this perspective reveals interconnectedness. Everything arises in relation to everything else. And by letting go of the illusion of fixed identities, you can engage with the world with greater freedom and compassion. But the doctrine leaves us with a chilling thought. If everything is empty, what does it mean to be real? And if there is no permanent you, then who or what is living your life? Why doesn't happiness last? No matter how much your life improves, whether it's a better job, a new relationship, or sudden wealth, the emotional high always fades. And when it does, you find yourself chasing the next thing, hoping it will finally bring lasting joy. This endless cycle is known as the Hedonic Treadmill, the idea that humans are trapped in a loop where lasting happiness always remains just out of reach. Psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell first proposed this theory in the 1970s. Their research revealed a surprising truth. Even major life changes, both positive and negative, fail to alter happiness over time. For example, studies of lottery winners found that after the initial euphoria fades, most people return to the same level of happiness they had before their windfall. In a similarly disturbing twist, people who suffer life-altering injuries, even paralysis, report returning to their previous emotional baseline within months or years. No matter how much life changes, you adapt, and the thrill fades. The implications are unsettling. If happiness always slips through our fingers, can we ever be truly satisfied? Are we destined to chase fleeting pleasures, only to return to the same emotional starting point, over and over again? Philosophers like Epicurus once believed that the key to a good life was maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. But the hedonic treadmill suggests a disturbing limit to pleasure's power. No matter how much you acquire, desire keeps moving the goalpost. What once felt extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the craving for more never stops. The luxury you once dreamed of becomes your new normal, and soon, even that isn't enough. But critics of the hedonic treadmill push back. They argue that not all happiness is fleeting. The treadmill might apply to material pleasures, but deeper forms of fulfillment, like meaningful relationships, purpose-driven work, and personal growth, can offer lasting satisfaction. Unlike fleeting joys, these sources of meaning are rooted in how you live, not just what you experience. Modern research suggests that you're not entirely trapped. Gratitude practices, actively focusing on what you already have, can slow the treadmill's effects by keeping you from constantly wanting more. Mindfulness, paying attention to the present moment, can also disrupt the cycle by helping you savor experiences instead of rushing past them. If you change how you engage with life, some argue, you can escape the treadmill's endless loop. But even this raises a troubling question. If happiness depends on constant effort, is it ever truly secure? What happens when gratitude fades, or purpose feels distant? If the very nature of your brain is to adapt to both joy and pain, can you ever find a form of happiness that lasts? And beneath all this lies a deeper, more haunting possibility. What if the pursuit of happiness itself is the trap? If the hedonic treadmill is real, the harder you chase joy, the faster it slips away, leaving you running forever toward a finish line that never comes. So, are we doomed to pursue happiness without ever catching it? Or is the secret to stop chasing altogether? What if you were always being watched, even when no one was there? Imagine living under an invisible eye, one that sees everything you do, even when you think you're alone. This is the disturbing reality described by philosopher Michel Foucault in his concept of Panopticism, the idea that modern societies don't need physical chains to control people. Instead, they make us internalize the feeling of being watched, turning us into our own jailers. Foucault's idea was inspired by Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, a prison designed in the late 18th century. Its structure was simple but terrifying, a circular building where a central guard tower could observe every prisoner. The prisoners couldn't see the guard, meaning they never knew when they were being watched, but they had to assume they always were. Under this system, direct punishment becomes unnecessary. The mere possibility of being watched makes people regulate their own behavior. And Foucault argued that this logic of invisible surveillance extends far beyond prisons. It shapes the world we live in. Schools, hospitals, offices, and governments operate on this same principle. People are more obedient when they believe they are being watched. Over time, you don't even need an outside authority. You internalize the gaze, you watch yourself. Think about social media. When you post online, you know that anyone, friends, employers, even strangers, could be watching. That knowledge changes how you act. You carefully curate your image, choosing what to reveal and what to hide. You perform, not just for others, but because the possibility of being judged is always there. In Foucault's world, the most effective form of power isn't physical punishment, it's making people discipline themselves. And here's the most unsettling part. When the eye is invisible, resistance becomes almost impossible. There's no need for a dictator watching over your shoulder. You become the enforcer, shaping your thoughts and actions to fit what the system expects. Foucault warned that this is the true danger of modern power. It doesn't just control your body. It controls your mind. But critics challenge Foucault's vision. Some argue that people find ways to resist surveillance all the time. In authoritarian states, citizens use coded language and underground networks to evade monitoring. Even in more open societies, individuals can manipulate or spoof surveillance systems to maintain privacy. Surveillance may influence behavior, but it does not erase free will or rebellion. Others point out that not all surveillance is oppressive. Systems of oversight can protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. Body cameras on police officers, for example, increase transparency and reduce abuses of power. In these cases, visibility empowers the public rather than controlling it. And yet, the invisible gaze remains. When you know someone could be watching, does that knowledge ever leave you? How often do you pause before sending a message, wondering who might see it? How much of your personality is shaped by the fear of judgment? And if society has trained you to monitor yourself, where does your true self even begin? Maybe the most disturbing question is this. If you're always performing for an unseen audience, when are you ever truly free? What if your life only matters because it ends? This is the unsettling core of Martin Heidegger's concept of being toward death, the idea that human existence is defined by the knowledge that one day you will die. Unlike other animals who live without this awareness, humans are burdened, and perhaps shaped, by the certainty of their own mortality. For Heidegger, most people live in what he called inauthentic ways. We distract ourselves with daily routines, social obligations, and mindless entertainment, all to avoid confronting the one truth we cannot escape, our own death. You wake up, go to work, scroll through your phone, all while pushing the thought of your eventual disappearance to the back of your mind. But Heidegger believed that this self-deception strips life of its meaning. True authenticity, he argued, begins when you face your mortality directly. When you accept that your time is limited, every choice becomes more urgent and more real. The awareness of death forces you to ask, if my life will end, what am I doing with it? Each decision carries weight, because you cannot escape the clock ticking behind everything. This idea resonates with existentialist thought. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that because life has no inherent meaning, the burden falls on you to create it. Death, far from making life meaningless, confronts you with the terrifying but liberating reality of radical freedom, the fact that no higher power will define your purpose. It's up to you to make your existence matter. Albert Camus took the question further. In the Myth of Sisyphus, he described human life as absurd. We seek meaning in a universe that offers none. Yet, Camus insisted that we must resist the temptation to give up. Even if life is a meaningless struggle toward inevitable death, the only true rebellion is to live fully anyway. But critics question whether this obsession with mortality is liberating or paralyzing. If death is unavoidable, why bother doing anything? If nothing lasts, doesn't that reduce all human effort to pointless noise? For some, dwelling on mortality doesn't make life richer. It breeds nihilism, the belief that nothing has value. If all your achievements will eventually vanish, your relationships, your dreams, why struggle at all? Others argue that you don't need to fixate on death to live meaningfully. Many people find deep purpose through love, creativity, or faith, without obsessing over their own mortality. Religious traditions, for example, often offer a vision of eternal life, transforming death from an end into a transition. And even without belief in an afterlife, isn't life intrinsically valuable because of the experiences we share and the connections we form? Still, Heidegger's insight lingers. Every moment you waste is time you will never get back. Your life is not infinite. It will run out. And if you never confront that truth, are you really living, or just passing time? And perhaps the most disturbing thought is this. If death is the only thing that gives life meaning, what happens when you realize that nothing, not love, not achievement, not even your memories, will last forever? Is human life, without laws or society, naturally violent? Imagine a world with no laws, no governments, no police, no authority to keep the peace. What would life be like? According to philosopher Thomas Hobbes, it would be a nightmare, a world where fear and violence dominate. In his 1651 work Leviathan, Hobbes described this lawless condition as the state of nature, a brutal existence where human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes believed that human beings, left to their own devices, are driven by self-interest, a relentless pursuit of survival, power, and advantage. Without a central authority to restrain these impulses, conflict is inevitable. Resources are scarce, and when everyone has the right to everything, violence becomes the natural solution. Distrust flourishes because, in a world without rules, anyone could be a potential threat. In such a state, life is a constant struggle, a war of all against all. To escape this chaos, Hobbes argued, people enter into a social contract, an agreement to give up some personal freedoms in exchange for security provided by a sovereign power. This authority, whether a monarch or a state, enforces laws, punishes wrongdoers, and protects people from each other. Without this social contract, Hobbes believed civilization itself would collapse into anarchy. But not everyone shares Hobbes's bleak vision. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing a century later, saw the state of nature very differently. To Rousseau, humans in their natural state were not violent, but peaceful and free. It was not nature but civilization, with its hierarchies, greed, and the invention of private property, that corrupted human innocence and created inequality. In Rousseau's view, society does not save us from chaos, it creates it. And there is evidence to challenge Hobbes's pessimism. Anthropological research suggests that many hunter-gatherer societies, those living closest to a state of nature, rely on cooperation rather than conflict. Studies of indigenous communities reveal systems of mutual aid, collective decision-making, and conflict resolution without the need for a central authority. This suggests that violence may not be an inherent part of human nature, but something shaped by social and environmental pressures. Moreover, critics warn that Hobbes's argument has disturbing political implications. If security is the ultimate value, then freedom becomes expendable. By justifying absolute sovereignty, Hobbes's ideas can be used to defend authoritarianism, the belief that people must surrender their liberty to a powerful ruler in exchange for protection. And if citizens are viewed as inherently dangerous, how easy is it for governments to use fear as a tool to control them? Yet, the shadow of Hobbes's state of nature lingers. Consider what happens when laws break down, in war zones, failed states, or natural disasters. Without a governing force, violence often surges. History is filled with examples where, when authority disappears, people quickly turn to self-interest and brutality. And perhaps the most unsettling question is this: are we civilized because of laws, or do we need laws because deep down we are not civilized at all? Without society's rules, are we peaceful by nature, or are we always on the brink of war with ourselves? Why do humans seem drawn to destruction, even when it defies reason. At the core of human behavior lies a contradiction. On the surface, we strive for pleasure, survival, and connection. But beneath these life-affirming instincts, Sigmund Freud proposed a darker, more unsettling force, Thanatos, or the death drive. This hidden impulse pulls us toward self-destruction, chaos, and ultimately, a return to nothingness. Freud introduced the death drive in his 1920 work Beyond the Pleasure Principle, after observing behaviors that defied the instinct for self-preservation. Patients who had experienced trauma often compulsively relived their pain through dreams or actions, a puzzling phenomenon he called the repetition compulsion. Why would the mind replay suffering instead of avoiding it? For Freud, this hinted at a deeper, unconscious drive, a force that pulls us back toward a state of inertia and death. In Freud's model, human behavior is shaped by a battle between two forces: Eros, the life instinct that seeks pleasure, love, and survival, and Thanatos, the death instinct that longs for destruction and dissolution. While Eros builds, Thanatos undoes, a force not only for personal self-sabotage, but for societal destruction as well. Wars, violence, and humanity's obsession with its own ruin aren't simply accidents of history. For Freud, they reveal something more primal, a deep and universal urge to destroy. And it's not just physical destruction. Freud believed the death drive also operates in subtler ways, in patterns of self-sabotage, reckless decisions, and the unconscious need to dismantle happiness. Why do some people destroy relationships they care about? Why do societies repeatedly march toward violence and war, even after witnessing its devastation? Perhaps, Freud suggested, there is something within us that craves the fall. But critics find the death drive deeply troubling and speculative. Modern psychology often attributes self-destructive behavior to trauma, mental illness, or social conditioning, not an inescapable death instinct. There's no clear biological evidence for a hidden drive toward death, and many psychologists see the theory as too abstract to test scientifically. If destructive behavior can be explained through cognitive patterns or emotional dysregulation, why invoke a mysterious, unconscious force? Others argue that Freud's vision is too fatalistic. It reduces human complexity to an endless tug-of-war between creation and destruction. What about people who heal from trauma? What about altruism and human progress? If the death drive is real, how do we explain the millions who devote their lives to building, not destroying? Yet, the idea of a subconscious pull toward destruction lingers, especially when the world's most advanced civilizations repeatedly turn toward violence. From ancient empires to modern warfare, humanity often seems incapable of resisting self-annihilation. Even in daily life, self-sabotage is everywhere. People ruin the very things they claim to value. Why? Could it be that, beneath our desire for happiness, there is a deeper craving to undo ourselves? And here's the most unsettling question. If the death drive is real, can it ever be overcome, or are we doomed to destroy ourselves from within? What happens when your sense of self dissolves, when the you've always known disappears? Ego death refers to the unsettling experience of losing the boundaries of individual identity. It's a phenomenon described across spiritual, philosophical, and psychological traditions, a moment when the sense of being a separate, individual self collapses entirely. In Buddhist philosophy, this experience isn't seen as a loss, it's a revelation. The doctrine of anatta, or no self, argues that the ego, the personality you cling to, is an illusion. Your thoughts, your memories, even the voice in your head, none of these reflect a permanent, unchanging self. When the ego dissolves, you awaken to a deeper truth, interconnectedness. There is no I, only a vast, unified reality. In this sense, ego death isn't destruction, it's liberation. Similar ideas echo in Hinduism. The concept of moksha describes the ultimate freedom, escaping the ego's illusions and realizing your unity with Brahman, the eternal and infinite ground of being. In these traditions, losing yourself is the path to finding something greater, a consciousness beyond the limits of individual identity. But ego death isn't confined to mysticism. Modern psychedelic research suggests that substances like psilocybin and LSD can induce ego dissolution. Under their influence, the familiar boundaries of identity seem to shatter. Users describe a profound sense of timelessness, unity, and freedom, as if the individual self is merely a surface ripple on a much deeper ocean of consciousness. For many, this experience is transformative, reducing fear of death, increasing compassion, and permanently altering their perspective on life. But there is a darker side. When the ego dissolves, the world can become terrifyingly unfamiliar. Without the stable framework of identity, some people experience psychological distress or existential crisis, a profound feeling that nothing is real, including themselves. If you no longer exist as a distinct individual who makes decisions, who suffers, who loves, and if your identity can dissolve so easily, was it ever real to begin with? Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre raise an even more disturbing challenge. If the self is an illusion, who is responsible for your actions? Moral responsibility depends on the idea that there is a continuous, autonomous you who makes choices and faces consequences. But if the ego is nothing more than a fragile construct, can anyone truly be held accountable? And if the person you think you are is just a mental fiction, what's left when that fiction breaks down? Critics of the ego-death narrative also argue that dissolving the self might be dangerous, not enlightening. The ego, they claim, serves an essential purpose. It organizes your experiences, protects you from chaos, and provides a stable sense of continuity. Stripping it away, especially without preparation, risks unraveling the mind entirely. Without a self, what anchors you to reality? And here lies the most chilling question. If your identity is something you can lose, was it ever real? And if the self is just a story your brain tells, what happens when the story ends? If God exists, why doesn't he make his presence undeniably clear? At the heart of divine hiddenness lies a haunting paradox. If there is an all-powerful, perfectly loving God who desires a relationship with humanity, why would he remain hidden from those who sincerely seek him? For many, this isn't just a philosophical puzzle, it's a profound emotional wound. Why would a loving deity allow honest seekers to cry out into silence, never hearing a reply? Philosopher J.L. Schellenberg captured the weight of this question in a powerful argument. If a perfectly loving God exists, he would ensure that anyone who genuinely seeks him would have clear and undeniable evidence of his presence. There are sincere, thoughtful people who search for God, but never find convincing evidence. Therefore, it seems that a perfectly loving God does not exist. The implications are unsettling. If God's love is infinite and unconditional, why allow any seeker to remain in doubt? What kind of love would stand by while someone yearns for connection, but is met with silence? For believers, divine hiddenness is not just an abstract dilemma, it is a deeply personal struggle. A mother prays for comfort after losing a child, but hears nothing. A skeptic searches for meaning in a chaotic world, but finds only emptiness. Why would a God who loves each person intimately remain so agonizingly distant? Religious traditions offer different explanations. In Christianity, some argue that faith requires trust without certainty, that God's hiddenness preserves human free will. If God revealed himself with absolute clarity, belief would become compelled, not chosen. Genuine faith, they claim, only has value if it arises from freedom, not from overwhelming evidence. In Sufi Islam, divine absence is viewed not as abandonment, but as a way to deepen the soul's longing. God's hiddenness, they suggest, draws seekers toward a greater spiritual awakening, a journey where longing itself becomes a sacred path. Mystical traditions across cultures echo this idea. The absence of God is a form of spiritual refinement, shaping the seeker into someone capable of deeper union. But these responses raise their own questions. Why should love be hidden? If a parent loves their child, they don't conceal themselves, they reach out. If human love seeks connection, why wouldn't divine love do the same on an infinitely greater scale? Why would a God who knows the pain of human suffering allow anyone to remain in loneliness and doubt? Critics of the divine hiddenness argument also push back. Some suggest that God's presence is available, but only to those who approach him with humility and openness. Perhaps God reveals himself subtly to protect the freedom of belief, while rewarding those who genuinely seek. Others claim that God's ways are simply beyond human comprehension. If divine wisdom is infinite, who are we to question the methods behind God's apparent silence? And then there is the problem of interpretation. What one person sees as divine absence, another interprets as an invitation to search more deeply. Perhaps God's silence is not rejection, but a challenge to go beyond easy answers and confront the mystery head-on. But for those who continue to seek and find nothing, the question remains. If a loving God exists, why would he allow anyone, no matter how sincere, to remain lost? And if God is silent, is that silence an absence or a test? Is life, at its core, a struggle for power? For Friedrich Nietzsche, the answer was yes. Beneath the surface of every action, whether noble or selfish, lies a deeper, more primal force, the will to power. This, he argued, is the fundamental drive behind all human behavior. Not the desire for survival, not the pursuit of pleasure, but the innate urge to assert, expand, and reshape the world according to one's own will. But Nietzsche's will to power isn't just about domination. It's something far more subtle and pervasive. It's the creative energy behind ambition, art, and self-transcendence. When an artist paints, when a philosopher questions reality, or when a scientist seeks to uncover nature's secrets, they are not merely satisfying intellectual curiosity. They are expressing a will to shape reality, to leave their mark on the world. Even acts of altruism, Nietzsche claimed, are often hidden expressions of power. When you give to others, you affirm your ability to help, reinforcing your own sense of superiority. This vision of life rejects traditional philosophies. Arthur Schopenhauer believed existence was driven by a blind, aimless will to live, a desperate struggle for survival in a meaningless world. Utilitarians like John Stuart Mill argued that the ultimate human goal is pleasure, maximizing happiness and minimizing pain. But Nietzsche dismissed both. He claimed that even these motives are surface-level manifestations of something deeper. The will to power drives survival itself, because life isn't content with mere existence. It wants to grow, to overcome, to dominate. And the will to power is not confined to individuals. Cultures, religions, and moral systems all reflect the struggle for power. Moral codes, for instance, are not timeless truths. They are expressions of power dynamics. Nietzsche saw Christian morality, with its emphasis on humility and self-denial, as a tool of the weak to restrain the strong. By glorifying submission, such moralities flip the natural order, making power appear evil while elevating weakness as virtue. But if life is a battle for power, what happens to those who refuse to fight? Nietzsche believed that modern society was producing a type of person he called the last man, a weak, comfortable, and risk-averse being who rejects power and seeks only safety and ease. For Nietzsche, this was the end of human greatness, a world where creativity, ambition, and self-overcoming are replaced by mediocrity and conformity. In contrast, he praised the Übermensch, the Overman, an ideal figure who embraces the will to power to create new values and rise beyond conventional morality. But critics of the will to power raise disturbing questions. Is everything really reducible to power? Love, compassion, and cooperation often seem to defy this framework. When a parent sacrifices for a child, is that really a hidden expression of dominance? Is every act of kindness just a masked attempt to control others? Human experience, critics argue, is too complex to be reduced to a singular drive, and there are dangers in embracing the will to power. If power is the ultimate value, does that justify cruelty in its pursuit? History is full of figures who believed themselves to be beyond morality and left trails of destruction in their wake. Nietzsche himself was acutely aware of this danger. He warned that the uncontrolled pursuit of power could lead to nihilism, a descent into chaos where nothing is sacred and destruction becomes an end in itself. For Nietzsche, the will to power must be harnessed toward creativity and self-mastery, not mindless domination. Still, the will to power forces us to confront a chilling question. Are our ideals, love, justice, morality, genuine? Or are they masks for the deeper, unspoken desire to impose our will upon the world? And if power truly is the essence of life, what happens to those too weak or too unwilling to seize it? Imagine being condemned to perform the same meaningless task forever. This is the fate of Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology who was punished by the gods to roll a massive boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down, again and again for all eternity. For Albert Camus, this myth is more than just a punishment. It is a metaphor for the human condition. In his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus argues that human life mirrors Sisyphus' endless labor. We strive for meaning, purpose, and clarity, but the universe offers none. We search for answers to life's biggest questions. Why are we here? What is the purpose of existence? But the world remains silent. This clash between our desire for meaning and the universe's indifference is what Camus calls the absurd. The absurd is not the chaos of the universe itself. It is the confrontation between our craving for understanding and a world that refuses to give it. No matter how deeply we search, the answers never come. Camus insists that reason cannot penetrate the mystery of existence, and that religion, too, is a kind of illusion, offering comforting but unprovable claims about meaning beyond death. So, what are we supposed to do with this absurdity? For Camus, there are three responses, and only one is truly honest. Suicide, a rejection of the absurd by escaping life itself. But Camus rejects this as a surrender. Suicide denies the experience of existence, the very thing that gives life its raw intensity. Philosophical leap, turning to religion or ideology to manufacture meaning. Camus calls this intellectual cowardice, an evasion of the truth. For him, belief in a higher order or divine purpose is a form of self-deception. Revolt, the only honest response. Camus calls us to face the absurd directly, without appeal to comforting illusions. This means accepting that life has no ultimate meaning, yet choosing to live fully anyway. This is where Sisyphus becomes more than a tragic figure. He becomes an absurd hero. Camus imagines Sisyphus at the moment when the rock rolls back down, when he turns to walk back down the hill. In that moment, he is free. He knows his task is meaningless, yet he defies the gods by continuing to push the boulder. Camus writes, "The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart." One must imagine Sisyphus happy. To embrace the absurd is to live without illusions, without false hope, and still find joy in the simple act of living. It means embracing the struggle itself, not because it has some cosmic reward, but because the act of living is our own creation. But can anyone truly live this way? Critics of Camus' absurdism question whether this stance is psychologically sustainable. Can human beings live with no hope for ultimate meaning? Don't we need a sense of purpose to avoid despair? Religious philosophers argue that our longing for meaning reflects a deeper spiritual reality, that the absurd is not a truth to be accepted, but a sign pointing towards something beyond human comprehension. In their view, Camus is simply stopping too soon. The absurd is a question, but faith offers the answer. Others suggest that Camus underestimates the richness of ordinary life. Love, relationships, art, and beauty may not provide cosmic answers, but they offer sufficient meaning for many. Why reject these everyday forms of meaning as mere illusions? Yet, Camus refuses these comforts. For him, to accept a pre-made system of meaning is to abdicate freedom. The absurd hero does not wait for the universe to justify itself. He lives in full defiance of its silence. And here lies the most unsettling question. If the universe offers no answers, can we find meaning, not in the destination, but in the endless, uphill struggle itself? In 1961, philosopher Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. She expected to see a monster. Instead, she found a mundane bureaucrat, a man who spoke in clichés, obsessed over regulations, and insisted that he was just following orders. Eichmann did not seem consumed by hatred or ideological rage. Instead, he appeared disturbingly ordinary. This observation led Arendt to a chilling conclusion. Evil does not always come from fanatics or sociopaths. Sometimes, it emerges from ordinary people who simply fail to think. She called this insight the banality of evil, the idea that great atrocities can be committed, not out of extraordinary malice, but through ordinary compliance with a system. Eichmann wasn't a mastermind, he was an administrator. He didn't personally kill anyone, but he organized the trains that sent millions to their deaths. His evil was bureaucratic. He performed his duties with efficiency, but without moral reflection. In his mind, he was not a murderer, just a man doing his job. And this is what makes banal evil so terrifying. It does not require hatred, only thoughtlessness. When people surrender their moral judgment to an external authority, the machinery of evil moves forward, quietly, relentlessly. But how does this happen? The psychological mechanisms behind the banality of evil are disturbingly common. In Stanley Milgram's famous experiment in the 1960s, participants were instructed to deliver increasingly painful electric shocks to an unseen person. Despite hearing the victim's cries of pain, most participants continued when ordered to do so by an authoritative figure. These weren't sadists, they were ordinary people who prioritized obedience over their conscience. And history is filled with similar examples. From the Rwandan genocide to the bureaucrats of Stalin's gulags, Many of the people who enabled mass killings were not monsters. They were clerks, soldiers, and office workers, following orders in a system that made moral reflection unnecessary. But is Arendt's view too simplistic? Critics argue that Arendt underestimated the ideological commitment of figures like Eichmann. Recent evidence suggests that Eichmann was not simply a thoughtless bureaucrat. He was a zealous anti-Semite who actively advanced Nazi policies. To call his actions banal risks minimizing the deliberate cruelty behind them. Others worry that the banality of evil oversimplifies moral responsibility. If we reduce horrific acts to mindless obedience, do we let perpetrators off the hook? Eichmann may have followed orders, but he chose to follow them. And not everyone obeys without question. History also remembers those who resisted. Yet, the unsettling truth remains. The capacity for evil is not confined to monsters. It lives in systems where personal responsibility dissolves into bureaucratic routine. When institutions reward conformity over moral courage, the unimaginable becomes ordinary. And here is the most disturbing question. If evil doesn't require hatred, only obedience, how confident are you that, under the right conditions, you wouldn't become part of the machine?